Yes.
Anytime you recall a memory, it changes. It's not a film, it's more of a press agent, if I can use that. And it's easy to prove that in 18-second sound bites. What can we do to keep that memory as much fidelity as the original thing? Or is that just something we have to live with?
I better jump in here.
There we go.
Get a chance to answer something I might know something about. Yeah, well, the question has to do with.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do.
We're so used to helping you guys.
Every time we try to remember something, we change it a little bit. You know, there's a pure memory. We had some event that happened to us. It may have been your wedding day or your first kiss or some memory. But every time you remember that event, you're corrupting it a little bit and you don't have that pure memory. And I believe you followed up and asked, is there something that we can do, a practice that we can do to help keep that original memory pure? Is that
Yes,
basically?
yes,
the same? Yeah. Well, first of all, I need to bring up the topic of schema. It's a natural part of human memory that we schematize events in our lives. If I asked you the last time you went to the grocery store, you could probably tell me that. If I asked you to tell me the story about 10 times back when you went to the grocery store, you could probably fudge your way through it, because there's certain events that happen every time that you expect to happen. And that's part of the schema that we have in memory. So first of all, you shouldn't feel bad that you lose specific instances. I believe that's a natural part of human memory. So the fact that you're recalling something, but you're losing the original pure memory. I don't think there's anything unhealthy about that. I think it's the way our brain is naturally set up to work. On the other hand, if you're really, if it's really important to you, then you want to start getting into things that we call technical mnemonics, ways that you can remember events. Remembering a list forward and backward, remembering the 14 cranial nerves or the different bones in the vertebrae. And that will help keep memories cemented. They'll keep them more pure in that regard. But who wants to do that with the precious memories of our lives? You know, weddings and first kisses and prom dates and things like that. I think it's a natural part of living and a natural part of how our memory system works. But I'll let them follow up their answers.
You could always write it down.
Or videotape.
But what we think happens is that all of our memories are volatile. So anytime you return a memory, every time you retrieve a memory, Mark talked to you about memory retrieval, every time you retrieve a memory, you bring it back out, you have to reconsolidate it. So you bring it out, you talk to your friends about it, you add a little bit, because we're great storytellers. We make it a little more exciting, a little more interesting, we add a little bit of flavor to it, and then we put it back down, and that's what we remember. So as he says, as Bob said, this is an absolute normal thing, we all do it, and the only time it's detrimental is if, in fact, the memories are completely false. And certainly we know that happens. So I have a great story. Can I tell my story?
Please.
So I have a great story. It wasn't mine. It belonged to somebody else who told the story in a research meeting that I was at. It was a woman who had a postdoc. And her postdoc said that they were interested in these memory retrieval. They were interested in laying down false memories. So with her postdoc, she concocted a scheme. And the scheme was that the postdoc would tell his little brother a story. And the little brother's story was going to be, do you remember the time, is what he said, do you remember the time in the mall when you got lost? Has anybody heard this story before? Yeah? Do you remember the time in the mall when you got lost? Well, over time, they brought the little boy in and they asked him the story about what happened to you in the mall. And he had concocted the most, that's all he got was, do you remember the time? I got lost, I was so scared, nobody was there, I called for mommy and she didn't come. And he had this elaborate story, and none of it was true. It all started from his brother going, "Do you remember that time?" Because we make up stories. How many of you think you've seen a picture from a time when you were very young, or you saw a picture, and pretty soon, every time you see that picture, you could tell a whole story about that picture, and you were, what, 6 months old? You don't know. So, memory works like that too.
I wanted to piggyback on that question, because the flip side of that is I've read about this as a treatment option for someone who has very horrific memory, to recreate that memory to help them heal through an emotional problem. So how do you think that plays in as well? I mean, have you found that to be, I don't know who would want to do that?
I'm going to put that on your side.
Thanks. Yes, so it has, oh, the question. Thank you. You know, I wasn't even getting this.
I wasn't hurrying
A
yet.
little slow in the uptake here. So the question was whether or not you could take advantage of the fact that we can retrieve these memories and use that therapeutically. If you have a memory that's problematic, that it's difficult for you to have to face, can you simply bring it up and repeat it until you're able to deal with that memory? A technique that's been used with phobias, which is the same idea. The idea is that you bring this person up and you have them repeat the thing that they're afraid of over and over again until they essentially habituate to it and it's no longer so terrifying. I don't know of any actual therapeutic use of that in memory research per se, but there's no a priori reason why it wouldn't work equally well there. In the PTSD literature, it has been used. So it's certainly been used to bring individuals into an environment similar to the one in which the trauma occurred. So loud noises or a military field of action using virtual reality has been used, and it has been used successfully.
I will say, from the neurology side and taking care of dementia, what's interesting is that people who have PTSD often see their PTSD fading out as memory progressively declines. So people may actually forget what it was that triggered the PTSD, and so conversely the PTSD gets better. And interestingly, that often is undercut when their family, trying to be helpful, keeps reminding them what it was, and so they keep it going. But in some cases, when it's allowed to sort of fade, that actually has a side benefit in reducing the PTSD reaction.
Yes.
I have a question. I have two questions. Is that okay? One is about EMDR, which is the eye movement desensitization technique. It's used to work with PTSD, and the other is, can you speak to prospective memory? Because I read that on the website you posted, and it's fascinating.
So I'm not, the question there has to do with the eye movement treatment for PTSD, which I wouldn't be very familiar with or authoritative on because that's not in the area that we deal with in our clinic. And the other was about prospective memory, which is, you know, we can, and Bob can probably talk about this a lot more detail than I can, but we divide up memory into different types of memory. And so we have retrospective memory, which is what most people think about, and we think about that as being a problem in Alzheimer's disease because remembering what happened starts to go away. But we also have prospective memory, and I made a comment about that a minute ago. That's remembering to remember. So that's the memory for an intention for the future, something you want to do in the future. So remembering that I have to come here to Whole Hog on Tuesday night, or remembering that I have a meeting at 10 o'clock.
Or remembering to take your medicine.
Or remembering to take my medicine, yes. And so that's, as I say, that's an area where Alzheimer's disease can affect people because memory generally is affected with that. And so their prospective memory for the doctor's appointment, taking their medicine, paying the electric bill, those are the things that get people in trouble with function very often. But,
So how do you work with, how do you improve your prospective memory? Like remember.
lists, calendars, appointment books. Prospective memory becomes harder and harder as we age too. That's one of the areas that, as I recall from memory research, is heavily influenced by frontal lobe function, and with slowing down of frontal lobe function, it becomes harder to put things into and get things out of prospective memory. So it's hard to remember. But that's where your iPhone, a written out calendar. Of course, the thing, I was always told, make a list of the things you need to do today, and my problem is forgetting where I put the list. But, so that doesn't help me. But that's basically the way you improve prospective memory, I think.
Yeah, and I agree with everything that you just said, and I just wanted to follow up that I know of some research where there seems to be individual differences in aging. Some people, as they age, they lose more of the retrospective memory. They're watching TV, that celebrity is on TV, and they can't remember, oh, it's Regis Philbin, they know it, but they can't remember, and that's unfortunate. But even more serious is when people begin to lose their prospective memory, at least in my opinion, because that has to do with remembering to do something in the future, taking medications, and some people get themselves into horrible binds health-wise because they forget to do something. And that's where they need that social network, family, caregivers to help them through that. But yeah, and in terms of trying to improve prospective memory, external memory aids, and that's where technology can help us out a lot, even with cell phone devices and computers, to remind us of schedules and details like that.
Yes, sir.
I will ask a question, but I think there was a gentleman that
Oh,
raised
yeah.
up first.
So admittedly, here's a huge quirk of mine going back to childhood, but it's a tool that I've used. Growing up and into weekly adulthood, I smell things on purpose to recall them. And going back, and I've done this every day. If I want to remember something, or I'm in the technology business, I will purposely smell it. My staff makes fun of me. My mother said I did that going as a childhood. I would smell everything when I would first grasp it. And that is a huge lock on my memory. What happens there? Why does smell works for me so well?
So I said, so the question here was, he uses smell to help him remember. So what he's doing is making a paired association. He's saying, I'll take this smell and it will associate with this and I'll remember it. It's a trick that I'll bet Bob could talk to you about for quite some time for memory. It's something that you can go read a book on how you should memorize things, and they will tell you to make these kinds of associations. So why would smell particularly be helpful? Because smell has a preferential importance to us in memory. Smell memory is something we do particularly well. It's a very old part of the brain. And now I will go to a place where I have to tell you, I'll start with, we don't really know, but there is this hypothesis out there, there are these ideas that suggest that because the olfactory system, the smell system, is so tightly coupled to the regions of the brain like the hippocampus, which are considered part of our ancient brain, the limbic brain, they preferentially talked to one another. And so associations between smell and other kinds of memories are very strong. If you have a memory, like let's take the one we've come up with before, a wedding day. Well, most women carry flowers on their wedding day, and frequently those flowers are very heavily scented. And you might be able to remember parts about your memory, your wedding day better that were related to those flowers, carrying them in your hand as you march down the aisle or throwing them over your shoulder or whatever, than you would other parts of that wedding day because of the association with smell. So it's kind of a two-part question. Smell has some kind of preferential action just as emotions do. These are ancient, they've been with us throughout history, they are well instantiated in the brain, and so their connections to memory are tight, very, very tight. But there's also this paired association. He's consciously making an association. I'll smell something and tie it to this. And that is a memory trick that Bob probably should talk about.
Yeah, there's a number of things you can do in terms of helping to remember tricks like that. And I think if that one works for you, then you should keep doing it. You've developed it over years and years. The thing is that I find frustration with my students, my college students, because I teach them these, they're called technical mnemonics, but you can think of them as memory tricks. At some time years ago, you may have learned the one like, if you're trying to remember a list, you draw a picture of the first thing and you have it interact with the second item and you have it interact with the third item. All those things work, but they only work if you practice it. And it sounds like you practiced it quite a bit over your life. If you do it once or twice, it's just going to be more burden than if you just write down the list or memorize it the old-fashioned way. And it's kind of unfortunate. But now, if you've ever seen on television, maybe on a TV show, one of those memory experts, they can be introduced to everybody in the room here, and then they can go around and say everyone's name. That's a parlor trick. You could learn to do that, assuming you have normal, regular memory. You could learn to do that. You have to practice it every day. And you'll be just as good as that memory expert would be. But the question is, why? Why do you, unless you want to be a performer like that person. So in that sense, yeah, if you develop a good memory skill, like paired associates, like you said, forming associations between two things, it will work for you if you practice it.
So I have to say, anecdotally, this is an unplanned plug for our host here, but Whole Hog was the caterer for my wedding, and I just have to say that barbecue is a very strong memory pairing. If you ever need something to tie a memory to, barbecue works great. Yes, sir, in the very back. Oh, I was supposed to get you next.
That's fine.
Okay, you're next, and then in the back. Sorry about that.
This is something you alluded to earlier. Could you talk a little more about confabulation, this phenomenon of people swearing that they remember something with all of these details that never happened? Is that pathological? What causes it? I mean, anything that...
No, it's not pathological. It's absolutely normal.
Repeat the question.
Oh, the question was, I'm never going to get this. So I just elbow me or something.
We need to have like a little card right there that just says repeat the question.
So the question was about confabulation. Is it pathological? And or can we explain how it happens that people can come up with memories that are absolutely false, that absolutely never happened? So the answer is no, it's not pathological. It's perfectly normal. We discussed to some degree we all do it. If you bring a memory up, the memory was real, and you talk about it, you put down a different memory. Maybe it's a slightly different memory, maybe it's a really different memory than the actual memory that you pulled up, depending upon what you have now interacted with another human being and created for yourself as the new story. So human beings tell stories. We remember things by stories. We think of our lives as stories. We understand our world as stories. We're really good at stories. And so when we bring back a memory, we make a story about it. If we're in a situation, so let's think of a situation. What about one where you felt like, oh my goodness, I'm gonna have to make a little lie here. And what's the first law of a good lie? I'll have to know what the first law of a good lie is. It has to be pretty close. It has to be something you'll remember, doesn't it? It has to be something that's close enough to a truth that you could pull it out, because someday someone's going to come to you and say, oh, I'm so sorry about whatever lie you just told. And you're going to have to go, not, what are you talking about? But, oh, yes, of course, it was a terrible situation. So you've already set yourself up for putting into your memory something that never happened in the first place. Now, most of us separate those things, but it's not so difficult to do that.
Even with things that never happened in the
Even with things that never happened. And what started this whole research thing that I told you about earlier, what started that was a whole rash of young women remembering sexual abuse from their fathers that never happened.
And another sideline to that is another serious side to kind of memory confabulation has to do with, there's been a lot of research in the last 40 years about the validity of eyewitness testimony in courtroom situations. And there does seem to be instances where you can get a person, you know, otherwise very credible person to sit on a witness stand and say, yeah, I saw him do it. And then years later, through something, you know, like DNA testing or whatever, they find out, no, he wasn't the one that did it. But sometimes the eyewitness will actually have a memory that says, no, I remember, I saw him do it. But they, at least in terms of science, no, he didn't do it. So whenever I talk about this, I do want to point out that probably 99, I don't know, you can disagree on the 99% of our memories are pretty good. But psychologists, scientists, we love it when something goes wrong. And we'll, you know, publish on the rare instances like, you know, faulty eyewitness testimony and the shocking situation that, like you just described also.
Gentleman in the back, yes, sir.
Mark, you mentioned when we get to that point, we're questioning, should we go have something diagnosed? Is this normal or am I
Right.
getting into dementia? And you said it's important to go to the right person. Where should we go? Here's another rock.
I'm going to try to remember to answer the question. So the question was, you know, when you go to get an evaluation, if you feel like you have a memory problem and you're going to go get checked out, I mentioned a minute ago, you need to go to somebody with some expertise or some knowledge of memory disorders and how to evaluate that. And where would that be? You know, to whom would you go? Well, obviously, I happen to think our clinic is pretty good with that. Our clinic is also pretty jammed and pretty backed up at UAMS, so it takes quite a while to get into our clinic, as it happens now. As a general rule, neurologists and psychiatrists should know more about memory disorders than other physicians. Neuropsychologists are the people who do the cognitive testing, very detailed cognitive testing called neuropsychological testing. I can say, without being too politically incorrect, that I see a lot of variation in the knowledge base of physicians, a lot of variation in practice. I see probably a dozen people a month who have been misdiagnosed in both directions. I see a lot of people already treated for Alzheimer's disease who don't have Alzheimer's disease, don't even have dementia. And I see the reverse. A lot of people told, don't worry, it's just old age. And actually they have a dementing disease. So I see it go both ways. And the only thing I can say is, if you have a trusted family doctor, you can often ask your family doctor, who would you go to? Who would you want me to see? They often have the experience of getting back reports, and they can reflect on who seemed to be more accurate. But again, memory clinics at universities, often we have a bit more expertise in the area, a bit more training in that area. Currently in the state of Arkansas, I'm the only behavioral neurologist, so I did a 2-year fellowship in dementia at UCLA, and that's specialized training. There is no other behavioral neurologist. But there are a lot of neurologists that can do a pretty decent job with evaluating memory, and there are a lot of psychiatrists that can do a pretty decent job with evaluating it. So the general rule of thumb is a neurologist, a psychiatrist should be better. It doesn't hurt to check them out and see if they have a special interest in this field. Also, I tell people who are, let's say people call me and they say, Mom moved to Cincinnati. Who do we get to see Mom? Well, very often the local chapter of the Alzheimer's Association will have an idea who in the city has a pretty good track record with evaluating for dementia. Here in Arkansas, Alzheimer's Arkansas is a different organization, separate from the Alzheimer's Association. Both those organizations would be able to give you some good advice in many cases. But I will put in a plug for our clinic at UAMS, the Walker Memory Clinic, and that's one place where people can go.
Visualization, seeing something happen, is a big part of it. And at least with me, I visualize a lot of stuff. I guess probably because I've been trained in art and so forth. I look for certain things. What's the difference between that and rote or word memory, where you try to remember words as opposed to remember what you saw, and it may have some elements of both. And also, if someone was blind, is their memory totally different than ours? Do they rely on just sound, smell, and whatever?
Okay, so that was a fun question. So the first part of the question was, thank you. The first part of the question was whether or not there's a difference in memories that are based upon visualization, upon what you see, versus memories that come in, for example, about what you hear or even what you feel. And the second question was, and if you're blind and you can't put down a memory of what you see, is your memory somehow different? So I'm going to start with the second one, which is no, your memory is not somehow different in any sense of how you make a memory. What you perceive and the way in which you perceive it may make that memory slightly different than what a sighted person would have. But in terms of how the memory is made and what the memory is and how you get it back, there's no difference. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? And the question about visual learning, visual memory versus other types of memory is an interesting one, because we know that people learn in different ways. The majority of people learn visually. Some people learn better by hearing. Some people learn better by touching, by kinesthesis, by feeling things. And this goes back to, are there different parts of the brain that are associated with different kinds of memory? So there's a kinesthetic memory might be more related to skill memory or motor memory, and therefore might not be so hippocampally dependent as, for example, the way we think of verbal memory, which is when you memorize a list of words. So the degree to which there are differences in which the memories, and the way in which the memories are put down, consolidated, and retrieved, there's probably little difference. Where in the brain that takes place may differ by the perceptual modality that you use, but most of us really use more than one. So if you're a painter, you're an artist, you said, you probably use both your eyes and perhaps what you feel. What you do with your hands, or even what you think about when you see, for example, the way paint goes on a canvas or something like that. Most of us are actually kind of multimodal in the way we bring a memory down. So it's not likely that it's exclusively one sensory modality that you use to do that. It's multiple ones.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Okay. Black shirt, and you go next.
My question is, well, it's about young people who have brain injury. For instance, my son was brain injured at birth from anoxia, but then I also have a stepson who was brain injured as a young adult from an attack. And so I've read, at least in Down syndrome, that people with Down syndrome, of course, they don't have brain damage, but they have a different type of brain, that they're more likely to develop dementia when they get to be older. So I would really like to know, I mean, my son cannot talk. He can say a few words, but he's a man of very few words. He's 36. And so it's really hard to know what his memory is like. But I would really like to know the chances of people who are brain injured either like at birth or as young adults. What happens as their brains age? Do they have a different type of dementia or a different type of aging?
Well, I'll start with that, and then we can sort of pass that around. So, and the question in this case was, is there a difference in dementia risk depending on brain injury, whether it occurs early or later in life, or depending on the type of brain injury? Is there a greater chance of getting dementia? Are there different kinds of dementia that people get with brain injury, for example? Am I rephrasing that somewhat correctly?
Perfect,
Yeah. So, so we know that in the case of Down syndrome, Alzheimer's disease is ubiquitous among people with Down syndrome. So people who have Down syndrome who pass a certain age After age 25, anyone whose brain has been examined after death who had Down syndrome has the pathological changes that we associate with Alzheimer's disease. Interestingly, not all of them have clinical symptoms that fit with Alzheimer's disease. So some do not show any cognitive decline. They may have some intellectual disability to start with, so they don't quite get, we would say, a fully normal cognitive ability to begin with, but they don't show a decline later in life. But when they pass away and we examine the brain, we find the plaques and tangles that we associate with Alzheimer's disease. And that's ubiquitous in Down syndrome. That led to the discovery of the first gene that was associated with causing early onset Alzheimer's disease, which is on chromosome 21, because people with Down syndrome have 3 copies of chromosome 21, and so the gene for the amyloid precursor protein is on that chromosome. And so that led to the discovery of amyloid way back, and some of the amyloid processing that leads to that disease. So Down syndrome is fundamentally a bit different because they have this genetic abnormality which gives them an increased burden of amyloid protein sort of automatically. Other brain injuries we know from studies of adults who suffer brain injury, a serious brain injury resulting in loss of consciousness more than 15 minutes is associated with an increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease later in life. So we do know that the brain trauma clearly increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease. How much that increases the risk is debated in the literature, and we don't have really solid studies to say just how much, but that much we can say. Somebody who is rendered unconscious for at least 15 minutes does appear to have an increased risk. And how that functions is unclear. Many people believe that the brain injury may trigger an inflammatory response, which triggers the cascade that we call Alzheimer's disease. Other people believe that that injury directly starts the formation of amyloid protein. We don't really know exactly. We know it increases risk. A birth injury, on the other hand, it's been very difficult because people with birth injury often have intellectual disability to begin, and it's very difficult to study cognition, at least in behavioral neurology. And you might talk about the academic work with memory, but at least in behavioral neurology, in the clinical world, we have no instruments that are used to study the cognitive ability of people with intellectual disability in the first place, especially those with language impairment. We have very poor instruments outside. We have a few that have tried to be developed, but there isn't anything really reliable. And so it's very difficult to study in the first place. We often see people who had a brain injury who later in life show a clear decline in the ability to function. And we think we associate that with the possibility that they've developed a dementing disease. So Alzheimer's disease happens to people who had a birth injury too. Is it more often? We don't have good epidemiologic data to confirm that. So clearly an adult injury, yes, that increases risk. It's a little fuzzy as to whether a birth injury raises risk of Alzheimer's disease in particular.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Do you believe that items that we use daily, say aluminum foil, has anything to do with the onset of dementia or any kind of brain problem?
I'm going to take that one too. So we'll pass on a few here in a minute. But at any rate, so the question was, do items that we use daily, especially aluminum foil or other aluminum things, does that play a role in triggering dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disease? There was a suggestion years ago that aluminum might be implicated in causing Alzheimer's disease. And a lot of this came from the old grind and bind studies, which is what we call them for short. So you take people who had Alzheimer's disease, grind up their brain and then analyze it to see how much of what's in there.
Yeah.
And so it turns out when you do that, there's more aluminum. So they said, ha, voila, that's it. Aluminum causes Alzheimer's disease. But actually, as it turns out, aluminum is a constituent part of several of what we call acute phase reactants. So if you cut your arm, you're going to have a higher level of aluminum in that wound as it's healing, because your body is producing substances to help you heal that contain elemental aluminum. So if you just look at the aluminum content, there's going to be more aluminum there, But it isn't that you had aluminum, unless you cut yourself with an aluminum knife, let's say, or an aluminum pot or something. It wasn't the aluminum that did the damage, if you see what I mean. So in Alzheimer's disease, there's more aluminum, but it's because of the disease process. So trying to study the incidence of disease in areas where there's more environmental exposure to aluminum has been a bit difficult. And we've had some studies that seem to suggest a link, but the majority of studies and the most careful research shows that there's not really a link between aluminum exposure and risk of Alzheimer's disease. Are there other environmental toxins that might be involved? Well, we haven't been able to identify one that is associated with incidence of Alzheimer's disease in particular. There are intriguing data suggesting that agricultural chemicals pose a very increased risk of Parkinson's disease. And you could say, in a way, Parkinson's disease often leads to a dementing illness later on. But in terms of actual environmental exposure that's linked to increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, we don't have solid evidence of that. And aluminum, you don't have to worry. You can cook with your aluminum pot or drink out of your aluminum can, and we don't think that that increases Alzheimer's risk.
What about medication?
And a follow-up question to that would be, what about medication? Again, there's been conflicting evidence. Many of the medications that people like to take are sedating medicines. People like sedatives. Like, how many people are having 2 or 3 beers? You know, so it kind of chills you out a little bit. But people like sedatives. You can sell Xanax on the street. It brings a hefty price. You can sell narcotics. So those drugs impair memory. So if you take a lot of hydrocodone, your memory's not going to be that good. And in fact, those drugs can actually cause people to have a dementia. In most cases, we believe the dementia goes away if you stop the drug. We know, though, that studies that look at lifetime use of anticholinergic drugs, those would be drugs like Benadryl, over-the-counter sleep medicines. Almost anything over the counter other than melatonin for sleep has anticholinergic properties, and studies show that people that use more of those earlier in life seem to have a higher risk of getting Alzheimer's disease later in life, although the methodology of those studies has been called into question. For a while there was some work that suggested taking benzodiazepines, those are old-fashioned nerve pills like Valium and Xanax, raised the risk of Alzheimer's disease later in life. A very careful analysis, though, of the data from population studies suggests that no, it's not actually increasing risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. Again, while you're taking the Xanax or the Valium, your memory's not going to be that hot, but it doesn't actually seem to cause Alzheimer's disease. And we think we may be going that way with the anticholinergics, but we still tell people to stay away from them because they kill your memory. And you might talk about the quality of sleep achieved with those drugs as well. So we believe that it messes up the quality of sleep. And so yes, drugs can cause a drug-induced dementia, but we're not so sure whether they really raise the risk of getting Alzheimer's disease as such.